So I was going to start this final video with a song that's called My Boomerang Won't Come Back, but honestly, I know the song lyrics are incredibly offensive and terrible, but it's been so long since I've heard them that I forgot how terrible they were. So what I'd say is listen with caution yourself. I haven't put the link up, but you'll be able to find it anywhere. This is a song that was incredibly popular. It's filled with incredibly offensive stereotypes of Aboriginal people, and its popularity by performed by both Charlie Drake and Rolf Harris was just absolutely meant that this was the story of Aboriginal people that a whole lot of white Australia heard. So that when we come to some 20 years later to the 70s, 80s, 90s, we start to get protest. And we start to get protest not just about everything else that we're protesting. So land rights, right to vote, right to be counted, all of the obvious kinds of things around freedom of movement and freedom generally. But we're also seeing the insistence that we make our own contributions and that we're not described. Now, interestingly, it takes slightly longer for that in a whole lot of the literary areas. But within music, there's already an incredible push in the 70s. By the time we come to the 80s, there are bands and performers who are simply insisting on it. And, while there was some very respectful material from people like Slim Dusty, who kind of had respectful and not so respectful stuff, there were people like Chad Morgan, who, by the way, some of you will know had learned later in life that his grandmother was Aboriginal, so of course that means he's Aboriginal. And then there were also these ideas and songs and movies and books about Aboriginal people, and this need to start to reclaim that was pushed by, interestingly, by a lot of our leaders, by a lot of people who had prominence in the space. But there were two people who had an incredible influence. And you recall I was talking before about Harold Blair. Harold Blair was sponsored and supported in no small part by Paul Robeson, also by the knowledge of Robeson. So Robeson was, this remarkable singer from the US, African-American guy. A lot of people will know that his version of Old Man River is probably the most famous one. And he was also really famously a communist. He came over in the 30s to Australia, and he was one of the first international people to talk about Aboriginal people and how poorly Aboriginal people were being treated by Australia. And he had a platform for it and talked about the importance of lifting up. This is at a time when none of us had any money. Now, fast forward to the 70s and 80s, and Sammy Davis Jr. came over, again, an African-American performer who was very interested and concerned with what was happening to Aboriginal people here. And there was, on one occasion, very inequitable court case that was happening. I won't go into the details of it, but it happened in Moree. And Sammy Davis Jr. provided the funding to the community, to the people who were arrested. And it was amazing. Nobody had that kind of money. None of us had that kind of money. And there wasn't the push to support any of those kinds of challenges. And so the money, interest and input came from outside of the country. It came from people coming in and seeing what was happening here and going, that's not fair. But it was also happening at a grassroots level. And of course the work had to come from a grassroots perspective as well. It had to come from us. And so by the time you get to the 80s, you have groups like Titus, the remarkable Titus, who you'll hear a link from. You have, Lou Bennett was a member of Titus, a Yoriora Jajarang woman, and who does remarkable work, continues to do remarkable work, finished her PhD a couple of years ago, and just gorgeous song work. And it was about protest, but it was also about participating in the popular music scene. You have, certainly you're starting to have songs like Black Fella, White Fella, Rumpy Band. You're starting to get substantial challenges using what was happening to Aboriginal Australia at the time. So Brand New Day, which we'll talk about at length in a few weeks. And then you start to get this very nuanced idea of the music being quite different in different places, and depending on who the people are, depending on the genre that they're engaged in. But for that, you need to have a really large amount of people engaged in it, and you also have to have a platform. And the platform is really interesting because radio has, for generations, been the main way that that's delivered. Now, certainly, it moves on to the internet in a really important way, but radio continues to be a medium that Aboriginal people are engaged with a great deal more than our non-Indigenous counterparts, both as participants in it as well as listeners. And so in 1988, on the occasion of the very large occasion of challenges to the colonial incursion, what happened was that there was a takeover of Radio Skid Row by Aboriginal people who had been given a very small time slot on an independent radio station in Sydney, and they went in and locked out other people. So I'll post up a link where you can read a little bit more about it. But it was a remarkable time, and it was those kinds of actions that started to transform people's understanding. Everybody heard them. There was a whole lot of, cranky people who were really resistant to listening to the concerns that people had, but there was also a massive amount of interest in what that could mean if we had our own station. Now there's over 40 stations nationally, and there's also, boundless amounts of streaming spaces, as there should be, as there needs to be. There's radio spaces in language, there's Karma, there's these remarkable spaces that now have sufficient volume of music that they're playing it all the time. And that changed because it needed to. That one of the reasons that literature is so important, that it represents and is made by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and to represent it to the world, to represent our communities to the world. One of the key reasons is actually some of the work that I do, which is on challenging symbolic annihilation. You cannot do that. So symbolic annihilation is the absence of representation, and you can't do that unless you have plenty. You actually have to have the music. You can't have the three songs that we started with. We need to have more than that. And so I urge you to engage with that. And I urge you to look at and listen to some of this work, and listen to some of the work around it too, some of the ideas around it. Listen to Deborah Cheetham talk about how hard it was to get mainstream just a few years ago, to get mainstream people to engage with her in building this first Aboriginal opera. You know, that's outrageous. And I'm sure you think it's outrageous as well. So think about the reasons why. And look, just a final point. Please get in touch with me if you're confused about any of this, you're having any trouble finding any links, or there's an area of music you're particularly interested in exploring or understanding a little more. We're going to cover a little bit of music ground as well, again, when we go into the film and screen work, because, things like Brand New Day, for instance, but also some of the visual representations within music videos is part of what I'm looking at. And yes, David Bowie, I'm looking at you. There are some really interesting things that happened across the 80s and 90s in terms of a switch being made on what it meant to engage with Aboriginal Australia. And so we'll cover off on a little bit of that. Lovely. Thank you.